Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Julia Sass-Rubin, and I'm a professor at the Edward J. Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. And along with my fellow conference organizers and Rutgers colleagues, a number of whom I see on this call, let's see, Charles Payne, Drew Gitomer, Saul Rubenstein, Michael Hayes, and Pengju Zhang. I would like to welcome all of you to the third session of the 2022 Education Policy, Communities, and Social Justice Research Conference. This is our 7th annual conference, so it's really exciting. There is one more session next Wednesday, also starting at 3:30, and that will be on Newark and New Jersey. It's very home-based. So you should have received an email right before this session reminding you with the login, and if you are registered, which you obviously are, you will get one next week as well. Today's session consists of 5 papers. Normally we only have 4, but there were so many good papers, we just couldn't say no. And the theme today is communities, schools, and COVID. There will be questions time at the end, so the papers should be over with at least 20 to 30 minutes left for Q&A at the end. If you have questions, you can either type your question in the chat and I will read it when it's time. Please indicate who it's for, or you can just say, I have a question for so-and-so, and I'll call on you to ask the question directly. And you can put the questions in the chat at any point. Okay, so let's get started. Today's first paper is titled Ramping Up the Role of Community Schools in Addressing Community Needs. The author is Jessica Shiller. Jessica is a professor of education in the Department of Instructional Leadership and Professional Development at Towson University in Maryland. Her teaching and research interests include urban education, school reform, culturally relevant school practices, critical race theory and methods, and civic education. And she is also a former teacher, which I think a number of our panelists and presenters share that background. So Jessica, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see slides? Yes, okay, fabulous. As Julia just said, the title of my presentation, Ramping Up the Role of Community Schools in Addressing Community Needs. I'm Jessica Shiller, Professor of Education at Towson University in Maryland. So what is a community school? There are roughly 10,000 community schools across the US that serve largely low-income and BIPOC communities. Community schools have these 4 pillars at their center: extended enrichment learning time, collaborative leadership and practices, integrated student supports, and active family and community engagement. And in the most recent federal budget Congress approved, there is actually $442 million to support the transition to community schools. So community schools are growing rapidly across the country, including in my state of Maryland, where there is legislation to support the ramp up of community schools. We call this the blueprint locally, and that provides funding for community schools in districts that have 55% or more concentrated poverty, which, as you can see from the map on the right-hand side, are quite a number of school districts in Maryland. And they're just starting to make this transition now, although Baltimore City has many and most of the community schools in Maryland already. So to my research questions. I wondered, right, how community schools served their students and families during the pandemic. What was the depth of the need in various geographic contexts where community schools sit? And what role community school coordinators played in meeting those community needs. In terms of conceptual frameworks, there are several that I bring to looking at this work, and so I want to share. My colleague Wendy Shaya at University of Maryland and colleagues developed this planning framework to determine how community schools meet the needs of families and students. And at the base, you can see the transactional needs, meeting safety, physical needs, food, shelter, clothing, which was critical during the pandemic. But ideally, community schools are working toward meeting transformative and fulfillment capacities and really getting communities to advocate for themselves. In addition to that community school framework, I'm adding here to thinking about community schools as place-based initiatives and resulting, because they're situated in various social, political, and economic contexts, we need to think about that as essential. Because my work is situated in Baltimore, a majority Black district, I draw upon these notions of Black geographies and racial capitalism to help us understand how place is shaped by the interaction of capitalism, race, historical disinvestment, and continued systems of racial oppression. So Black geographies link the political economy of race and capitalism, where Black communities are often sites of infrastructure and social decay, as well as geographic surveillance. And you can see the redlining map on the far left as a historic redlining map from the 1930s, and it sort of matches the more modern map in the center of Baltimore, and really shows how persistent these patterns of are of inequity and how they persist over time. Racial capitalism describes a system in which white individuals and predominantly white institutions use non-white people to acquire social and economic value. And it's through that mechanism that the maps continue to persist and look the way they do. A colleague of mine, Lawrence Brown at Morgan State, put a name to this some years ago called the Black Butterfly, in which the actual geography itself looks like the shape of a butterfly. And we can see that sort of hyper segregation existing across the city in that shape.
Yes, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can you go into display mode, sweetie, so they can see it better, just to make it larger?
I'm very sorry.
No worries. I just think some computer screens are small, so it doesn't. Please forgive my interruption.
Not a problem. I hope people can see. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are some images I really want people to see in a couple minutes. So in order to pursue this study, I did semi-structured interviews with 15 community school coordinators. I also looked at American Community Survey data to understand the ways in which the inequities playing out across a variety of indicators. And I worked with a great geography grad student to help me put this into a GIS mapping software to create a story map that I think conveys the data and visualizes it in a way that's, I think, really effective, better than in some ways than an actual paper. So I'm going to show you excerpts of that today. I will share the link to the story map that people can actually take a look at later on, and that is my paper right now, and it will become a paper over the summer. But I'm hoping what you can see now is where the story map begins. Which is with an actual map of the city of Baltimore. All the purple dots are community schools distributed throughout. And if you click on those dots when you get the link to the story map, what you'll see is a link to a series of pieces of information, including the CSA, the Community Statistical Area, relevant information like address and stuff. But what's really important are the indicators around race, ethnicity, poverty rate, access to healthy food, vehicles, internet, and rates of neighborhood violence. And you can see that for every community school now in Baltimore City, which did not exist before this. So as the story map progresses and drills down to neighborhood level, I demonstrate some of the disparities across neighborhood, which brings the Black Butterfly notion to life. You can see the kind of hyper segregation of neighborhoods like Penn North, which are represented by that orange bar, which has high rates of folks without access to vehicle and internet, side by side neighborhoods like Medfield and Hamden, which have the opposite, represented by the blue line. And these are developments, obviously, that didn't happen overnight, but are the results of decades of disinvestment and have taken shape via race. And here's another sort of way to think of this and to show how this plays out. So looking at capital investment flows, which is highly determined by race and class, you can see that capital flow is much higher in neighborhoods that are less than 50% African American, for instance, low poverty neighborhoods, and the opposite, the sort of flip, is true in predominantly Black and low income neighborhoods. So this is just another way to represent that same data, which is, look, where you can see across this map, right? So at the center here, you can see sort of this butterfly idea take shape with the darker blue, representing, in this particular case, households without vehicle access. And again, the purple dots are the community schools distributed across the city. And so we can see kind of in which neighborhoods there's the deepest need around a variety of indicators, and what schools and school clusters are gathered together in those areas. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why that is happening. Sorry, let me just go back. Can everyone see that? I can. I think I leaned against something by accident. Anyway, so the dark blue areas obviously map almost perfectly onto the historical redlining maps from the 1930s. And so community schools in these areas obviously working constantly to compensate for the historical disinvestment, even if they don't frame it that way. Community schools contend with the transactional needs around them. And during the pandemic, these were heightened, and community schools played a vital role in delivering food, laptops, clothing, toiletries, meeting those transactional needs kind of around the clock. And obviously, like I said, I did interviews with community school coordinators. In the story map, you'll be able to see the full video excerpts of some of these interviews that I will share just a short excerpt with you now, and the ways in which transactional needs were met by community school coordinators, and also the depth of those needs. So in this interview, a community school coordinator tells a story about a family who did not have internet access. And when they got a laptop from the school, they needed a hotspot as well, which the school provided. I'm sorry, I hear an echo. Is that somebody's needs to mute?
Please mute yourselves. Yep. I will take care of it.
Thank you. I'm still sort of hearing that echo, yeah. Sorry.
I'm still muted, there we go.
Okay, just to rewind very quickly, we're talking about internet access, lack thereof. The school, in this case, provided laptop and hotspot to a family. As the family used that laptop and hotspot from room to room, the internet would kind of go in and out and would stop working. Because that family did not use a laptop or Wi-Fi regularly, didn't really understand the inner workings, and went to the school to understand, to get the computer fixed. What the coordinator was able to explain to the family is not only how the hotspot and the laptop worked, but what he realized was this community called Cherry Hill, which was built as a segregated community for Black folks during World War II, has never been in place with investment in infrastructure in not only in broadband and high-speed internet, but very little investment in general, with housing that dates back to the 1940s, one bus that links to the rest of the city, and no supermarket. And therefore, families, children in this neighborhood have limited access to educational, political opportunities built into the geography of where they live. The community school coordinators act individually to try and address those needs, but as this coordinator said, it's like bringing an umbrella to a hurricane. They're acting individually to address the decades of disinvestment and racial isolation rather than in a coordinated way. And so what I'm concluding from the interviews and the laying out sort of the geographic data are several things. So using the mapping and census data alongside community school distribution across Baltimore visualizes the context of Black geographies and racial capitalism in which the schools sit. The community schools work daily to get resources and supports for students and families and meet those transactional needs. But those emerged from decades of disinvestment, which the coordinator interviews revealed. Acting in a more coordinated way, of course, community schools could be working across clusters of schools to serve communities in much more targeted ways, rather. Perhaps by becoming anchor institution, because they're in walking distance of many residents, the schools can offer support that goes well beyond the typical community school offerings, like after-school programs, but become more robust hubs for food distribution, legal services, ongoing mental and physical health, and wellness. Community schools could also be spaces through which city agencies and nonprofits could operate, because they're uniquely poised to address challenges families face. But the work needs to be coordinated and have a more lasting impact. Using this frame of Black geographies and racial capitalism really helped to show and demonstrate sort of the depth to which the need is in the city of Baltimore, and this can be mapped onto almost any city in the United States, of course, using the same kind of data. And because community schools and their coordinators often look at the current data, it's helpful to see this because they can link to seeing how this has been the case over time, over many decades. And I presented this to the school district a couple of months ago, in which that was a very eye-opening experience for many of them. With the scale up of community schools, of course, though, there are many questions remaining. How will community schools, or to what degree will they meet the needs of BIPOC communities across the state? Measurement of community schools is still largely defined by improving attendance and academic achievement. So will community schools be sort of given a chance to really succeed in other measures? And how do we even do that, measure the impact on communities? Much more research is needed to understand these questions and to really also anticipate how policymakers will declare community schools success or failures if they are only measured on narrow indicators like attendance and academic achievement, since the community needs have been produced by a nagging racial capitalism that has that continues to dog communities across the state of Maryland, of course, and the United States. So I am going to copy and paste this link in the chat so people can view the full story map. And also, I'll put my email in the chat too if you want to get in contact to see exactly what this work kind of represents, how it might even be replicated in your own context.
Fabulous.
So,
thank you very much.
you.
Thank you. Okay, so moving along with the community schools theme is our second paper, which is titled Measuring Community School Coordinator Scope of Work in a Countywide University Assisted Community Schools Initiative in New York, a pilot study. The authors are Naorah Rimkunas and Eliza Brown. And Naorah is an assistant professor and director of the Netter Center, UACS Regional Training Center in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Leadership and Social Work at the College of Community and Public Affairs at Binghamton University. Can you say that in one breath? I cannot, Naorah. Eliza is the Community Schools Regional Network Director at Binghamton University Community Schools, and Naorah is going to be presenting the paper by herself. Let me take it over, hand it over to you.
Thank you. Let's see, I think I shared the wrong screen. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the introduction. Happy to be here and see some familiar faces. I am a professor of community schools at Binghamton University, and then also, as Julia said, I direct the Regional Training Center funded through the Netter Center at Penn for a university-assisted community schools, community of practice. And I see lots of familiar faces who also joined that, so really happy to see you all. What I am presenting today, and I'm sorry Alyssa could not join us, but she's at a hooding ceremony, and wanted to be at that. What I'm presenting today is our preliminary research, really to drive our evaluation around the scope of work for our community schools. We run a countywide initiative. We are a relatively large initiative at Binghamton University where we do have local work, which I will focus on today, but we also host 4 technical assistance programs where we offer technical assistance in regions of New York and then also across the state of New Jersey, kind of depending on what the focus is. We have lots of student and faculty engagement in our community school work. We offer coursework and credentialing around community schools, and then have statewide, local, and national partnerships, and then work towards our own sustainability to promote and evaluate community schools. And what I want to focus on today is our local work through our regional network, which is how we really implement our work utilizing the university assisted community schools approach that is really pioneered out of University of Pennsylvania. And just to echo some of what Jessica set up for us, really university assisted community schools are the difference being is that the university or college in the community plays an important role as a partner, sometimes a lead partner, but not always. We've learned through the pandemic that our schools can be both in-person hubs, but they can also be hybrid hubs, and they can be virtual hubs to develop partnerships between higher ed, schools, families, and community partners. And that our goal here is to expand opportunities, supports, and services for children's families and the community. We also like to emphasize and work hard on this and do it very imperfectly that we are a democratic, justice, and equity seeking institution in partnership with our schools in Broome County. And we use a 5-pillar model that was recently introduced in a paper last year, Partnerships for Equity and Excellence. It retains the 4 pillars, but then adds this community-based teaching and learning piece. I don't present much on that today, but it is kind of a direction that we're going in our model development. In our local implementation, we have what we call the Binghamton University Community Schools, so BUCS, our regional network, which is what our partnership looks like between Binghamton University and the local districts and schools, and also community agencies. And this is where our community schools work takes place locally, and any school is welcome to join this network. We provide technical assistance and professional development to our community school coordinators through monthly meetings. We meet twice a month. This is an active community of practice that has been in place for about 7 or 8 years that really kind of came out of our School of Social Work because many of our community school coordinators were social workers and wanted a community of support around this kind of rarefied work that they're doing as community school coordinators. As part of running this, and that is where my colleague Elissa Brown comes in as the director, she brings in community partners to talk about violence prevention, food banks, mental health services, things like that, so that our coordinators are able to make connections with those agencies. We offer professional development around the community school pillars, DEI, around restorative practices. And then it's also an opportunity for our faculty at Binghamton University to bring their research in and also learn about the needs of the schools so that we can try to align our research from the institution with the needs of the community. I think many of us in higher ed can think about the problems with pushing into schools when the needs are not addressed, and that can go sideways very quickly. And we really try to attune to that. Just some quick numbers. In the county, there's about 1,700 students. We serve 9 districts out of 13 in New York. Counties are kind of subdivided into multiple districts. This can be a different model in other states. So we have 13 districts in our county alone, and which can lead to lots of interesting complications, but we serve 9 of those through the regional network. 8 of those are public and 1 is a private Catholic school. 15 coordinators serve them, and they're assisted by 24 social work interns. That's for 21-22. And that takes place in 31 buildings, 31 school buildings. And we also have 6 districts of those 9 who are engaged with BU faculty on different research projects. And then we also place 49 undergraduate students who are also interning in those schools. We place many more, like hundreds more, but 49 who are specifically interning in community schools. So those coordinators are kind of dealing with all of that. All right. So this makes for a very different model, a different approach to what a community school coordinator looks like in their role. And what we have tried to do with this kind of beginning evaluation and beginning look is that these localized, nuanced, and complex positions can be very hard to measure and evaluate. And so what we wanted to do was explore their scope of work. It was something that we kind of imagined we had a handle on, but in practice, maybe not so much. We wanted to be able to answer to our school partners who have an interest in what is happening in the schools. And we also wanted to address this issue that our initiative is growing and outpacing the capacity of our regional network to really support these community school coordinators. We wanted to address this outpacing with strengthening our professional development, trying to fold in school leadership and staff based on what our findings are. And this is just kind of our ongoing continuous improvement plan and initiative evaluation is beginning to look at this scope of work. And so what we've done are 2 surveys. One is a weekly survey, and then another was an end of year survey. The weekly survey was kicked off in January, and what I'll present today is our findings through May. The end of year survey was also conducted in May. This is all self-reported data and comes with all the limitations of self-reported data. Of our 15 community school coordinators, we had 12 who reported. The other 3 have been out on leave for various reasons, and these do represent, however, our 9 school districts. And so one of those surveys is a weekly highlight survey, and this is where community school coordinators are reporting weekly what they're doing, what kind of contact they're making with families, what kind and how that contact with students, families, teachers, administrators is how it reflects our community school pillars, what our priorities are. So we're trying to kind of categorize what their work looks like. And there's always an option for other, because what we know about community school coordinators is that they're often pulled into other tasks, putting out a lot of fires. And so we wanted to make sure that we captured some of that work as well. And then our end of year survey is 24 questions, qualitative and quantitative, mostly around their professional development and mentoring needs. We are just using descriptive analysis. It's aggregated for this particular presentation. And then our qualitative data, we use thematic analysis, and the limitations are vast, as you can imagine. We have a very small sample. We are not trying to generalize broadly. We're really trying to get a glimpse of what's happening within our own community. One thing that we didn't capture is experience level in the end of year survey. That would have been a big identifier because we're a small group. But it is a place that we would like to explore a little bit further is how does this reflect the experience of our community school coordinators? And so just a quick reminder of what a community school coordinator does. They are really the community organizers that build this bridge between schools and their communities. They create, strengthen, and maintain all of these pillars, these integrated student supports, family engagement, the collaborative leadership priorities. And try to develop the strategic alignment between needs assessments and what kinds of programs are coming into the schools, developing lots of community partnerships. And so what we found around the pillars is that most of the engagement in our county is around integrated student supports and family engagement. This was not a huge surprise to us considering COVID. Also just considering what we know about the needs of our community. We are a high poverty community in Broome County. We had been a statewide Promise Zone designated county, one of just a few in the state. We have a ethnically diverse population within the county and a racially diverse population within Binghamton City. Collaborative leadership, this is one of the least understood pillars in community schools. And so this was also no surprise that this is one that we found that only some of our coordinators were engaging with. And I should say that these numbers represent the amount of time weekly the coordinator is engaging with these particular pillars. So, you know, about 2/3 of their time with integrated student supports, about 1/4 of the time with family engagement, and so on. It was also not a surprise that the community-based teaching and learning was a very kind of low engagement. My guess is that this is around a misunderstanding, one, of what that pillar means. It's new, and then also perhaps not a lot of engagement around it in general. I think this is one of the harder concepts to bring in. This is how we bring in community resources into actual teaching and learning. So bringing cultural assets into the classroom, bringing in business assets into the classroom, things like that. And this is either a lower priority or not as well understood. And so I'll just talk about the two that were, or the three that were most engaged with. This is kind of just a quick profile of what integrated student supports looks like, where we're bringing in about 600 plus students into our drop-in centers, which are classrooms that are open all day during the school day, where there is either a social worker or a peer mentor in place. And students can come in, no questions asked, and talk if they need to. There are many group meetings happening with K through 12 students, 700 plus, lots of one-to-one tutoring. It could also be counseling. It could also be working directly with linking a student to services, and then lots of classroom push-in, where community school coordinators are entering into the classroom and working with a teacher on something. It could be tutoring, it could be delivering a lesson. We also know that sometimes our community school coordinators are tapped to substitute in a pinch. Lots of scope creep. Around family engagement, lots of phone calls were made to families, text messaging, 200 plus home visits, which was nice to see considering COVID. We have always been an initiative that has valued making home visits and linking directly to families that way. And so there was a dip in that during the first year of COVID. And so just seeing that some of that was happening was interesting. Lots of in-person meeting with families, and that could happen at cafes, coffee shops in the area. And then there were also 75 plus parent cafes, which are specific family engagement kind of roundtables that happen across the districts, and then 2 district fairs that served 500 plus families. Hang on a second, I have dropped everybody's picture right in front of my arrow. There we go. So collaborative leadership, what we learned is that coordinators are working with the people that we want them to. They're attending meetings with administration, with guidance counselors, with implementation teams and support teams, which is what we want them to do. They're also engaging with their diversity, equity, and inclusion offices and maintaining community connections. They're also engaging with a lot of school personnel and more administrator interaction than we expected. We expected the teacher interaction, but also lots happening with the school social workers, counselors, and school psychologists. So other priorities: expanded enriched learning opportunities. Almost half said that they were engaging in that weekly. And so this would be tutoring after school, things along those lines. And that community school coordinator is really working to coordinate those efforts. So linking students and families with those expanded learning opportunities. And then the community-based teaching and learning, they were indicating that about a quarter of the time, they were engaging with this particular pillar, but there's less concrete reporting here. We didn't get a lot of examples from the qualitative data, and the assumption is that there's a little bit of confusion around how to even interpret this particular pillar. One thing that we did find, though, and this became the other category, which was really eye-opening for us, is that 2/3 of our coordinators are providing direct supervision to field placements and interns. And this is specifically around social work interns. These are undergraduates and graduate interns, and they are spending 11+ hours a week doing this. So like a full day. And we had heard that this was happening, but we did not know the numbers and the extent of which this is happening. And so this becomes a huge challenge, and I'll talk about that a little bit more for where this takes our regional network. Uh-oh, what happened there? Stray slide. And so in the qualitative data, we were able to glean some successes and challenges. Understanding the role of the regional network. Our community school coordinators do understand the role of the regional network, which is kind of a special community of practice that is a bit unusual in the community school world. And they also understand relatively well their roles as community school coordinators. They're responding to school and family needs, which they do prioritize, and they're facilitating sincere reflection around student roles in community. They're experiencing personal and professional growth as coordinators, and they're working with families and children directly. They're building trust in the school and community. And so these were all things that we were happy to hear prioritized. But the challenges, I think, we're also telling that there's also role confusion. And I think some of that role confusion is perhaps linked to some of what we don't know, which is how long some of these coordinators have been in practice. Lots of frustration around the time spent supervising interns, frustration around conducting needs assessments. And this has come up specifically within COVID because it's been very hard to, one, find the time, get administration to prioritize needs assessments, and just get back on track with those yearly needs assessments that we had been conducting in the past. Teacher buy-in has been a challenge. And so, you know, that's kind of all of that interaction with teachers. There's still some teacher negativity around what is the role of the community school coordinator. Not enough time in the day. I think anybody working with schools understands that. But challenges too with how do you practice collaborative leadership? And even though there are successes with reaching out to families and caregivers, there's also challenges with doing that. The ones that just don't respond, finding ways to get a response. What are all of the different avenues to do that? And then also the challenge of students in and out of school for long periods of time. We've lost students in the mix of COVID between quarantines and then also just being unable to get to school because of busing shortages, and where we have lots of rural schools, and that's just posed a problem for transportation getting to school. So our high level implications for practice is that
I'm really sorry, but we really have to move on. It's
oh, are we there already?
We're well
my
over,
alarm didn't go off. All right, I'll just shuffle through these and I will share this so everyone can have it later. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Sorry, 15 minutes goes really fast. I know it's hard to believe it's time already. So, okay. So and I'd be happy to make the slides available. So thank you. Our third paper is titled Exploring Resilient Communities Through Pre-K-12 Physical and Programmatic School Design. So it's very much related to community schools, but taking us into the physical space. The authors are Katrina Struloeff and Bruce Levine of Drexel University, and Lindsay Fischer, Rebecca Milne, Kerrie Frymire, I probably tortured all of those names, and Sean O'Donnell of Perkins Eastman Design. Katrina, Lindsay, and Rebecca will be presenting the paper. Katrina is a PhD candidate in Drexel School of Education. She is also a former K-12 educator. Lindsay is a design strategist at Perkins Eastman, who is an urban planner by training. And as someone who teaches in the School of Planning and Public Policy, I'm all over that. And Rebecca is the Director of Design Strategy at Perkins Eastman and also has pioneered several studies that have looked at collaboration and individualization in workplace, healthcare, and educational environments. So not new to research. So let me turn it over to them.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Is that, can everyone see that? Excellent. So thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for joining us today to go through this presentation on exploring resilient communities through PK-12 physical and programmatic design. We are now in a moment in time where circumstances have heightened awareness of the value of educational environments, not just relative to the success of individuals, but also to the sustainability and resilience of our communities. So recognizing the breadth and complexity in developing appropriate environmental design responses that may inspire a new generation of post-COVID school designs, we have assembled an interdisciplinary team of architects and academic researchers, as you can see here. And I can let also Rebecca and Katrina on the call just say a quick hi if you'd like.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Julia. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, excited to talk to you all today. But I think it was a great introduction at the beginning, so I'm happy to move forward.
Yeah. So again, just drawing on the researchers and architects from both Perkins Eastman and Drexel University School of Education, we have spent the past year exploring these emerging ideas, and the work continues for us. So starting with our framework and methodology, first we must recognize that it's not just one crisis that we need to address, and that there are at least 4 parallel crises occurring. So the first one, of course, is the health and well-being concerns related to COVID-19. Economic recession is also something, that's been ongoing for a couple of years now related to the pandemic. Social justice and the Black Lives Matter movement have been top of mind, and global warming and sustainability concerns are also ongoing. So these 4 crises are occurring in tandem, snowballing off one another and causing additional stresses to societal systems that we rely upon. Rather than simply dealing with one issue at a time, the pandemic has caused an already underlying economic, social, and environmental concern to heighten, which is requiring multidisciplinary and multifaceted responses. This is where we find community schools as a promising solution to develop resiliency in the face of future crises. So the global pandemic has triggered, as we all know, a massive shift to online learning for the first time in history. While many schools are slowly returning to in-person lessons, there has been a fundamental shift in the delivery of education. Technology has been adopted by many teachers and students, allowing for more individualized learning and flexible scheduling. But there are limitations to this technology, which has become obvious over the past 2 years. So understanding how we effectively adopt technology in a way that promotes community equity and well-being will be key to the successful adoption of the new normal. This will challenge the design of schools, much of which has changed very little over the past many decades. So schools are really ripe for redesign, and COVID-19 might be the catalyst we were waiting for to fundamentally rethink how we design and develop schools for the whole child. In the future, community schools will be a key component of addressing inequality through a variety of means and methods. Not only do they improve teaching and learning, but they partner with families, creating a culture of connectedness and incubating innovation. As we know, schools are not islands. They are interconnected with social, environmental, economic, and public health. This is why we believe in a holistic design approach that includes creating buildings that reduce environmental degradation, engaging and fostering in lifelong learning and growth, promoting community resilience, and supporting the health and well-being of individuals, families, and the community as a whole is essential to success. So I'll pass it off to Katrina now to talk a little bit more.
Katrina, are you there? She was having some audio issues before.
I actually don't see Katrina. She might have had to log in and out again.
I think her internet has just been spotty.
Can one of you cover her portion?
Yeah.
Rebecca, do you want me to continue?
Yeah, do you want to continue? And yeah,
sure.
I'll
yeah.
put it
so
up.
I think we can go through this fairly quickly. I know we've been talking about the pillars. So I'll just, continue through past this slide, but as we know, the pillars that we saw on the previous slide are also correspond with characteristics of high quality schools. So over the past number of years, there's been a growing body of research that seeks to understand the types of environments that help students learn and thrive. Yet access to schools that embody these characteristics are often uneven, with these schools typically serving white middle-class students. And today, more than half of American children in grades K to 12 live in low-income households. This is the highest percentage witnessed since the statistic first began to be collected in 1960s. Community schools, however, provide a powerful and promising opportunity to address the needs of communities facing poverty and racial isolation, ultimately fostering student intellectual, social, emotional, and physical development. In many models, including this one created by the Learning Policy Institute, integrated support services and systems are central to whole child learning and development. As noted in the report, Design Principles for Schools, opportunities for exploration, intervention, and growth must be plentiful, rich, and extensive to meet students where they are and help them discover their purpose and direction. With proper integration, support services, and opportunities, students are encouraged to develop their own agency, understand what motivates and inspires them, and advocate for changing certain less desirable conditions that they may be experiencing. As shown in this model by Kay Brooks, Stafford, Brizard, ensuring that students have the basic support for healthy development, including stress management and self-regulation, allows them to achieve the building blocks for skills, mindset, and traits like self-awareness, sense of belonging, resilience, and curiosity. This ultimately helps maximize the lifelong opportunities and strengths in each individual learner. Stress management is a particularly important building block for developing healthy, engaged students. Many students and families across the country face stressors like housing insecurity, health and wellness concerns, safety concerns, lack of childcare, food insecurity, and a lack of before and after school engagement. New ideas. Sorry, yeah, sure,
sorry.
Yeah. Jump in.
Sure.
Yeah.
New ideas of holistic wellness really address concerns associated with these stressors and align with these principles associated with community schools. Thinking about the big picture and taking that into account when considering how students learn and grow and helps to maximize each student's potential. We feel that it's really important to look at the interconnected nature of the stressors identified on the previous slide, and it really means that a complex and integrated solution is required. This is where we feel that community schools play a crucial role. They create partnerships within and throughout the community, and they're able to support children and families deal with major stressors, not only allowing students to be more healthy, but also being better prepared for learning. Through our partnership, we've done a number of different things, really trying to seek and investigate the unique promise that community schools provide for students, families, and communities at large, with a particular eye of what that means for design. Our methods have included roundtable discussions, online surveys, structured interviews, and design charrettes, really operating in this community school space and ongoing research to identify trends, challenges, and opportunities. We've found, kind of throughout our presentation that it's really important to underscore the interconnectedness of the public educational system on social, environmental, economic, and public health factors. So going into some case studies. In our initial literature review, we did not find, a significant body of research, which I'm sure many of you can relate to, about the physical form of community schools and how the design of these schools impacts their success. Due to the unique needs of within these spaces, including room for community partners, support services, and the like, we think it's really important to really understand the underpinnings and within the design that really help support this interconnectedness. One of the ways that schools can support students is really to expand the range of medical, health, and dental care services available in school. School-based health centers provide access to primary care services in schools. These clinics are uniquely designed to mitigate barriers for both youth seeking adolescent-friendly healthcare environments, as well as for staff and younger children as well. In this example, the clinic at the DC High School is one of the 8 across the city that students can attend. This one is staffed by MedStar, a network of hospitals, and is situated directly below this new entrance and has been added to the existing building. It's really allowed for this program to flourish and support kind of the whole needs of the student. One with a very modest environmental need is the weekend backpack programs in Cambridge in Somerville, Massachusetts. Like other districts, they found Washington losing access to free meals if they're not attending school, and can be one of the most challenging things for homeless children, especially over the summer. Accordingly, this school system allowed for sending home lunches, breakfast, fresh fruit over the weekend, and the food is discreetly packed in the children's backpacks each Friday afternoon, ensuring that students are better prepared to learn for the following week. Another way that we can see that schools are tackling these stressors is to engage with gardening, cooking, and nutrition, and really allowing that to be integral to their education curriculum. In DC, expert educators from First Farm Foodprints teach hands-on lessons that get students excited about growing, preparing, and enjoying fresh local foods. Martha's Table is also, we found, a great program in DC that similarly has combined education and health and wellness. Their motto is that every Washingtonian deserves the opportunity to thrive, and so they aspire to support strong children, strong families, and strong communities by increasing access to quality education, health and wellness, and family resources. We are seeing the expansion of early childhood care and education across the country, and an emphasis on helping children from birth to the 3rd grade to succeed. One example is the Barton Elementary School EduCare campus, that the first standalone center in Southern California, as a demonstration child development center that cares for children from birth to 5 years of age. Another expansion is the conventional school scope before and after school programs. Really realizing that they can further enhance these children's lives and help them become career and college ready, they created a school. And in building a school facility, they created a public-private partnership to also allow for 89 affordable housing units on campus as well.
So next we'll just go into some of our findings. So we did, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, we've had 2 charrettes so far. And a number of themes have emerged from these conversations. So first we have, welcoming, comfortable, homey spaces that limit stress and support well-being for all space users. Also ensuring that there are inclusive design processes means that historically marginalized voices can play a significant role in defining the outcomes of the schools. Seamless transition further reduces stress and also allows for a focus on entry and exit, for instance, as well as between services and programs. This is also where privacy becomes a key consideration. So providing privacy for all users allows them to choose to be discreet when using a range of services, including spaces like food pantries, clothing closets, laundry facilities, and showers. There are also a number of what we're calling fresh ideas that have come out of the design charrettes. The 3 that stood out to us in particular were the removal of signifiers of economic status, the implementation of social emotional regulation rooms and spaces, and the adoption of trauma-informed design principles. In completing this research with educators and school and district administrators across the US, our intention is to extrapolate our findings in order to generate an assessment tool that schools and communities can apply to understand what services are available at both the school and in the communities, and what partnerships could be formed that don't already exist, as well as what gaps exist that could be filled by the school. Once these assessments have been completed, context-specific design guidelines are tailored to the unique needs and opportunities that will be available for school administrators and school and district administrators, as well as facilities and staff and designers. So while there are a lot of discussion and studies that are focusing on programmatic delivery of community schools, few resources exist on how school design can help to respond to the needs and services provided by these schools. Our study proposes to fill this gap and highlight the needs for thoughtful design that can support students, their families, and the community at large. So thank you for all being here with us today, and we look forward to this discussion and also, any ongoing communication that you may want to engage with us in over the coming months as we finish the study off. Thank you.
Fabulous. I think you guys win the prettiest slides, hands down. It's nice to have designers doing your PowerPoint, right? I will turn you over. I would be happy to give you my slides anytime. So
thank you.
To pretty up. Our fourth paper is titled Navigating Uncharted Waters, Relational Trust, Social Networks, and Evidence Use in K-12 Central Offices During a Pandemic. The author is Robin Tamarelli McKeon, who is a PhD candidate at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. And Robin has also served on and actually chaired her local Board of Education for 13 years. I don't think she's chaired it for all 13 years because she probably would be much more beaten up looking than, if she had, but she has chaired it for large chunks of time. And she was embarking on her dissertation about research evidence use and relational trust in K-12 central offices when the pandemic hit. So she pivoted to study how district leaders in 2 districts made decisions about how and when to reopen for in-person instruction. So Robin, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen. It's not at the top. Okay, let me make it big. Thank you, Julia. Can everyone see that now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I've been interested before I decided to go back to school for my PhD in research evidence use and the disconnect between what goes on in policymaking often and actual research evidence. So I decided to do my dissertation on central office decision-making because it's something that I've been involved in and found is kind of understudied. There's a lot of stuff about school level and classroom level, and then the greater state level policymaking. So I decided to look at research evidence use in K-12 school districts and focus on the idea that relational trust is related to effective evidence use because people are generally not too willing to trust evidence that's presented to them from sources that they don't trust. So I decided to look specifically at trust among board members and administrators and between boards of education and administrators in districts, but also among within the district with staff and other people in the district and within the community between the administration and the community and boards and the community. So then in terms of my theoretical structure of my study that I was setting out to do, I wanted to look at types of evidence use, instrumental or tactical use, which is when a user identifies a problem and a solution that might be implemented. And that's the type that is usually discussed when we talk about evidence-based decisions in education. But there is also conceptual and symbolic use where a user comes to understand a problem differently, and persuasive and political use where a user presents information as part of an opinion-changing process, which is a part that I've found fascinating in my own personal experiences. Different types of use occur in different situations and contexts, and multiple types can occur simultaneously. So I also was interested in looking at how social networks are related to relational trust and how people can serve as brokers between different networks. One of the areas of my interest was the network between academic research and policymaking at the local level and how that is brokered. So for my study, I am focusing on relational trust in terms of leadership. looking at using Brick and Schneider's 4 aspects of relational trust: respect, competence, caring, and personal regard for others, and integrity and honesty. And I'm focusing, like I said before, on networks, both external to the school district and internal within the school district. And then I'm looking at how different people serve as brokers or bridging agents with external sources and also within the district. So these are my research questions that I set out. And these were my research questions really before the pandemic hit also. So to what extent does evidence influence decisions and policies of superintendents, central office administrators, and boards of education? And does evidence use differ depending on the type of decision being made? How is relational trust related to evidence use? And what role these different agents play in evidence use? So what happened when the pandemic hit was I was going to do a study of lots of districts in New Jersey to try to do comparative analysis. And I realized quickly that access was not going to happen to get the data that I had set out to do, because school districts were all shut down and it was going to be really challenging. So I decided to focus specifically on a couple of districts to do case studies of how they navigated the situation. So little did I know when I set out to do this, how long schools were going to be shut down and how long students were going to be in either remote or hybrid instruction. So the effects of this have been seen and obviously still coming out, how much difference it made of how your school district handled the situation, whether you went to school in person or not, and what type of instruction students received during the pandemic, whether it be remote or hybrid or in person. New Jersey happens to be one of the states with the highest rates of remote instruction, but there was a lot of variation within the state. As those of you that are from New Jersey know, some districts opened up in the fall of 2020 in person. A lot of them were hybrid, and others were remote for the entire school year. So this timeline, I'm not going to get into all of it, but the main key points that are important for my study are that when school districts were trying to figure out what to do over the summer of 2020, they got very last minute changing instructions from the Department of Education, where in the beginning of the summer, they were told that districts needed to submit a plan that includes in-person instruction. Then they were told that parents could choose whether they wanted to have remote instruction for their student, which threw a whole nother twist into it of districts having to offer both to everyone. And then at the last minute, the governor gave permission for districts to choose to be all virtual when they opened in September, which was very last minute and got very political. So in the fall of 2020, there was student districts opening in all 3 forms. The majority were hybrid, but a lot were remote. And some of them made last minute decisions to stay remote. So looking at these districts and the question of how and why did some districts open and others stay remote, there were a lot of factors. There was the leadership capacity of the superintendent, central office, and board of education, which involves a lot of the things I'm interested in looking at. There's the financial and physical capacity of the district in order to open up safely, all the different things that were required by the Department of Education, and whether or not the district could afford to do all of the things they were required to do. There was pressure and politics from local teachers and administrators unions. There was the influence of the county superintendent and office, the local health departments, and what neighboring districts were doing. And then there was community politics and pressure. So my 2 cases are similarly sized districts. One's a little bit larger. The one that I call urban town is much more urban than the other one, which I call suburban town. You can see that the main differences between the 2 districts are economically and racially. The districts are dissimilar. They both had similar high functioning, what I would call superintendents, administrators, and boards going into the pandemic. And, when I initially set out to pick my cases, it would have been nice to have contrasting cases of districts, but frankly, I wasn't going to be able to get access to very dysfunctional districts at that point in time. So I chose to instead focus on 2 districts that managed to stay open and look at how research evidence use and relational trust played a factor in that. So for my data collection, I did surveys of the two superintendents and board presidents, I did interviews with as many board members as I could get, which was 3 in each district, and the central office administrators in both districts, and then observations of their public board meetings from June 2020 to June 2021, so a year of board meetings. And then I used various documents also. I coded the transcripts, and I'm still finishing the coding on the interviews of the board meetings and superintendent letters. And some of the codes I started out with, like, they were related to the concepts I outlined earlier in terms of the types of research evidence use, the different aspects of relational trust. But I also had things that emerged, like these 3 themes that you can see in red, emerged as like the biggest 3 themes at the board meetings: diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism. You know, in the aftermath of George Floyd was a big part of those board meetings. Effective instruction and wellness was something that, you know, changed during COVID in terms of the focus, but it's something that goes on normally in school districts. And then this new theme of how to open schools safely was totally COVID related. So there's a lot of different codes that I used, but when I did it, I started to see patterns emerging. And when I do the interviews, I'm sure that they'll be a little bit different after that data is all entered. But in terms of the results of my study, I'll just highlight a few things I found. So in my survey, I found that both districts' leaders reported moderate to high levels of relational trust and research evidence use, which is not a surprise because I was kind of expecting them to say, you know, that, but considering what I knew about the districts and confirmation bias, where they are going to say that they're using research evidence. But I found interesting differences on different questions that I asked them. So, for example, I found similarities in terms of what resources superintendents use when making decisions, but I also found some differences, whereas the urban town superintendent said that he relied heavily on information presented to him by professionals in his district. The other superintendent did not say that. And the biggest difference I found was when I looked at the types of decisions they were making. The superintendents, when they were making decisions about curriculum and instruction, were looking towards their own district administrators, their own data, the teachers and building staff in their district, you know, consultants and professional development experts, which you might expect them to use. Board of Education was not particularly important in those types of decisions, which is also not unexpected since, you know, the boards are not experts on curriculum and instruction. When you look at the superintendents making decisions about COVID, reopening schools during COVID, they were relying on the local and state health departments, the county and state education department, colleagues in other districts, much more so, and not as much, you know, on the one district said the Board of Education and the other one didn't, which I found really interesting. And I think that will emerge in the interviews. So I found some interesting things in my preliminary data, looking at the data from the board meetings and superintendent letters. So when we look at the different types of evidence use and look at the different themes of types of decisions, you see some interesting things that stood out. Mandated research evidence use is when, you know, a school district or an individual is told that they need to use certain evidence to make a decision. And you can see that during the decisions about how to open schools, there was a lot of mandated use going on. There was a lot of specific direction coming from health experts, from the state, districts being told that they had to use evidence in a certain way, whether it be COVID dashboards, contact tracing, you know, medical stuff, or whether it be specific requirements for policies that they had to use during that time. And you can see that during decisions about the other types of things, that mandated use wasn't as prevalent. Tactical and instrumental use was very high for opening schools, which makes sense because people were making decisions about how to open the schools. Conceptual enlightenment use was highest, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, which also makes sense because people are trying to change people's understandings of those issues. Same thing with political and persuasive use, because those are issues where people were trying to change somebody's opinion. there was a fair amount of political use on how to open schools, which I think anyone who was paying attention, all the debates about masks and whether or not to open schools was fairly political. Another type of analysis I'm going to be looking at is looking at relational trust. And I just broke it out. I haven't done a lot of cross-district between the two districts comparisons yet, but looking at the type of relational trust and the theme, you can see that respect was a big factor in the decisions and discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism, which makes sense. You can see that competence was the highest on the decisions about how to open school, which also makes sense because people were trying to convince other people that they were doing it safely and that they knew what they were doing, and also in terms of instruction and wellness. So these are just examples of some of the types of things I'm going to be looking at with my data when I get it all in there. Relational trust was fairly similar between the two districts, slightly different. So I think I'm going to find a lot of similarities between the two districts on certain things, and when I get into the data, a lot of dissimilarities in terms of how specific decisions came about and how the specific people in the district were getting their information and navigating the decisions. So, for example, when I asked the board presidents who they turned to, they both said they turned to the district superintendent and other central office administrators, which makes sense because those would be the brokers of information that bring the information to the board for decisions. I did notice that they listed the Department of Education as an important resource for almost all types of decisions, except decisions about reopening during COVID, which also makes sense because the Department of Education was giving conflicting advice to districts and leaving a lot of the decisions on them, and not really giving them clear instructions about what they were supposed to do. You can see that the one Board of Education, the suburban town president, turned to the other Board of Education members much more so than the urban towns president. And the urban towns president relied on the New Jersey School Boards Association and the county school board and university faculty and research, which I found interesting. The suburban town Board of Ed president had been on the board for a very long time. And there were some long-term board members versus the urban town had a lot newer board members. So I think they were turning to these outside organizations and people more for advice because they felt that they needed it, versus I think the suburban towns board, from my preliminary analysis, felt that it was knew what it was doing more and turned to its community members for more of its information. So there was a lot of talk about academic research from both the superintendents and the board presidents, and also in the Board of Education, the public Board of Education meetings, where I was a little bit surprised by that because in a lot of studies I've seen, there's not a lot of connection between the university and school districts. So that's something else I want to explore. It's preliminary at this point, but I feel that looking at the case studies will give a really good insight into the processes that I wanted to study and how the actual brokering goes on and the political use of research evidence. So I think when I start going through the stories of the districts, which I didn't get into today, it'll get really interesting. Just the stuff about the anti-racism is fascinating to see how it was discussed in the two districts. The one district had done a lot of initiatives prior to then, before COVID, and had made a lot of specific headway in programs and collected a lot of survey data from their constituents, and the other district hadn't. And so it was fascinating to watch how those discussions unfolded, between the boards and the administrators and the public about those issues. So there's going to be a lot more interesting stuff that comes out of the case studies that's not related to the data that I showed you. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Really interesting stuff. And yeah, we'll move along and hopefully have some time for questions at the end.
Okay.
So our fifth paper and final paper today is titled Navigating the Entangled Pandemics of COVID-19. Could everyone please mute themselves? Okay, I'm just going to put anyone who's I hear noises from in the waiting room just to make sure that they are not the person who broke through. So it's titled Navigating the Entangled Pandemics of COVID-19, Structural Racism and Organized Abandonment. And the authors are Edwin Mayorga, Eliza Murphy, and Maya Plotnick. Edwin and Eliza will be presenting the paper today. Edwin is an associate professor of educational studies at Swarthmore in Pennsylvania, and the director of the Cultivating Community Together study. He's also like an incredibly affirming chatter who puts nice things in the chat for everybody, which I really appreciate. Eliza is a rising senior at Swarthmore, majoring in educational studies and economics. And she grew up in South Philly, attended public schools, and is hoping to return to the district as an educator, which is a fabulous goal, Eliza. And she's also part of the Cultivating Communities Together study and has been since 2021. So let me turn it over to you. And again, if I get any noise effects, I will take them out of the room. So hopefully we won't have any more interruptions. I'm so sorry, Robin, that you had all that. First time we've been Zoom bombed. Oops. Yeah, I need to give you sharing. I was trying to, sorry about that. Give me one more second.
That's okay.
My bad. Okay, go for it.
All right, thanks everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay. Okay, let's see. And how about the slides? Can people see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Hi everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for coming today, and Julia and the committee, thank you for giving us an opportunity to be in community with y'all. Again, my name is Edwin Mayorga, and my accomplice co-conspirator here, Eliza Murphy, and I will talk us through a little bit about our project. Something happening?
It's just Jeremy. I'm going to get him out of here. Give me 1 second.
Okay, sounds good. We're going to keep it going because that's what we do around here. So I wanted to speak about what we're going to speak about today. Let me see if I can. Okay. What I wanted to speak about today is a project that is still going on, the Cultivating Communities Together, and actually in many ways still kind of at its beginning phases. And I'll talk us through a little bit of that, but really want to focus on the ways that we are thinking about how we were thinking about COVID-19 and how one of our particular participating schools, or what I like to call school community ecosystems, had been navigating COVID-19. And so we'll talk about the study and then situate that. Eliza will talk us through a little bit about the history and situating it within the context of place. And then we'll zero in on one particular case, and hopefully that will we'll share a little bit about what we've gleaned from the initial phases of that work, and what directions we're going on from here. So as we've all been affected by COVID-19, what for our particular project, and I'll go into the project in a moment, in many ways it's created a number of challenges, in particular the questions about whether or not the school would even whether we would be able to go into schools, work with the communities that we had started to cultivate relationships with, as well as not even thinking about whether or not we would be able to even engage in some of the kind of work that we were doing. So in many ways our project had to pause, slow down, perhaps, but also to I think focus in on what are some of the challenges that schools were facing and what role we potentially played as a collaborative kind of co-conspiratorial research group, how we would be able to think about and address or help to sustain, let me say it again, think about how we can sustain each other in these particularly difficult times, and difficult in a historic kind of proportional way. And so one of the things that we engaged in was just thinking about, we started to meet with teachers at one of the particular schools that we'll go into in a moment, and started to do some of the storytelling and thinking about this. And so, what became evident is, first and foremost, and I think it's quite obvious to most, if not all of us, that the pandemic, this particular pandemic, has found us languishing and struggling, concerns around our safety, our health, the health and concerns about our students and their families and the broader community. But what COVID-19 has also done is, the pandemic also did, was to amplify and highlight a number of other structural, what we might think about as other forms of kind of structural pandemics, including structural racism, anti-Blackness, and what Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes as organized abandonment. And so really thinking about, within the context of racial capitalism, what has brought us to the production of schools as they are, and in particular in our case in Philadelphia, how have schools been produced and reproduced within these different historical conjunctures, and what that has meant for how are schools going to navigate a pandemic that was not anticipated, of course, clearly, and still deal with the, perhaps we can think about it the way Saidiya Hartman describes, just kind of this notion of the afterlives of slavery. How do we continue to think about and deal with those kinds of lingering and ongoing systemic problems, including, and here I go back to this notion of organized abandonment, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others who have talked about it are, refer to it as, the concept of organized abandonment signaling the process of governing populations through callous yet purposeful neglect, framing many humans and other life forms as surplus to the contemporary political and economic order. And what it does in many ways is produces forgotten places, as Gilmore talks about in one of her pieces, in which she starts to think about this idea, introduce the notion of organized abandonment. And she notes that forgotten places are not outside history. Rather, they're places that have experienced the organized abandonment characteristic of contemporary capitalist and neoliberal state reorganization. And so the particular schools that we are looking at, and we can often think about the ways in which the kind of organized abandonment of all schools in Philadelphia, of all public schools in Philadelphia, and how that has been faced, and that kind of processes of unorganized abandonment happening in a multi-scalar kind of way. So it happening on the local level, at the level of the state, and the level of the country. And so seeing how those kinds of global processes circulate and have produced the kinds of schools, and what the state of the schools were, and the state of many neighborhoods, often many of them becoming forgotten places over time, and those schools and those communities not being able to have a variety of resources, or operating from a state of abandonment, and taking on the kind of death-dealing effects of COVID-19. Our project is looking at, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with okay, here we go. No, sorry, I was just trying to move everyone's picture out of the way so I could look at the slides. But thinking about school and community partnerships as being one of the kind of signature transformative approaches that, or reform approaches that, strategies that schools and school districts were implementing. And so our project, Cultivating Communities Together, is looking at at the variety of models that exist within Philadelphia currently, but it also looks at it historically. And so while we are using that as a focus of study, we are all in looking at it as a focus of study. We're also thinking about, well, what are the limits of this solution if we're thinking about the larger structural pieces? We think that it is part of a solution, but is not the silver bullet that I think often in education policy reform, we're often looking for these kind of silver bullets that are going to solve all these problems, and which often leads us to limited and kind of undermining and often reproductive of inequality kinds of processes. And so tied to that, and the last piece that I'll talk about here is just the importance of thinking about what I've described in other research and work as, and draw heavily from Indigenous scholars, Gerald Visioner's notion of survivance or sobrevivencia. But it's our capacity, how do communities, schools, school and community ecosystems engage in practices often in the face of organized abandonment to do more than just survive, right? But to actually create thriving and kind of, as Jean Anyon talked about, the late Jean Anyon, one of my teachers, spoke about as radical possibilities. What kind of radical possibilities emerge from within those kinds of practices? And that's really the entry point for which we are looking at that this project is informed by, and has only further been amplified by amplified by COVID-19 and these other ongoing pandemics. So just very quickly, and I'll hand it over shortly in a couple slides to Eliza, but the project has two kind of lead research questions. First is, in what ways, and this is, so it's both a historical and ethnographic kind of contemporary study. The historical part is really thinking about in what ways has Black politics and Black-led movements in Philadelphia informed and shaped relationships and collaboration between public schools and neighborhoods over time. So in these processes of organized abandonment and ongoing processes of organized abandonment, how have Black politics and Black-led movements informed and shaped the practices of sobrevivencia in both in schools and outside of schools and in neighborhoods and communities? And second, and this is more the contemporary piece, what are the experiences and goals of students, staff, parents, administrators, partners, and community partners in contemporary partnership models? And how do these perspectives inform best collaboration practices? What we're trying to do actually is put those two questions into conversation with one another. How and in what way are contemporary movements a reflection of a history of Black movement and Black struggle in the city of Philadelphia? And how do we see that in various ways kind of creep into perhaps, kind of from the ground up into different kinds of local, hyper-local practices that schools are using. And so rather than thinking about solely the kind of despair of organized abandonment, actually thinking about these practices of sobrevivencia as a kind of guidebook or a kind of action guide for future steps. Now, the final thing that I'll talk about is our framework, which is a queer, intersectional, and abolitionist framework. And so here we're thinking about, how does this framework allow us to see something in particular about organized abandonment? So using our research questions, how does, and here we're drawing heavily from queer kinds of theory and politics, as well as Black feminist and Black queer theories, and abolitionist kinds of transformative theories. And we put those three pieces together to think about how notions like safety and community can be further problematized within the constructs of racial capitalism. Community is used by everyone as a term, but we're asking, what does that look like in terms of politics and practice? And so how is community built? What are different diverging visions of community? How does community then become a construct in which, within the landscape of power inequalities, then create a particular vision, while other visions are often subjugated and rendered invisible. And so similarly, then how do we think about, another piece to this is then how do we honor and help and learn from resistance and joyful practices? Abolition, or this notion that Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, I promise she's not the only person that I study, but I do study her closely. But her notion that freedom is the place, right? And so if we think about schools as a site to fuel our collective pursuit towards freedom, that it's a convening of different ideas and practices, but that those practices are not just political and resistance oriented, but that they are also joyful. And that it is not solely about dismantling what is, but to genuinely think about in fresh ways what is to come and the world, the kind of world that we want, the kinds of schools that we want and have a right to. And so, the last piece here, just kind of then putting, organized abandonment resistance in conversation with one another, really thinking about what is it the schools that we want, what is it that we need. And then this, the final piece is just a kind of community-driven participatory action research. So in this contemporary context, we're looking at creating within these different case studies that we are developing and implementing now, or starting to. We have school-based research teams at each site, but that within these research, the SBTs are teachers, parents, students, and our college kind of research team members. And so we have these kind of larger overarching questions that we're looking at, but at the local site, we're also looking and turning to the community members that are most directly affected by organized abandonment to develop the kinds of questions and meaningful processes that mean the most to them. So it's a multi kind of faceted project, and this is what we're seeking to do. All right, I'll hand it over to Eliza.
Yeah, thank you, Edwin. So in the next section, we have some brief historical and social context for both the School District of Philadelphia and then also the Kensington neighborhood where Kensington Health Sciences Academy is located, which is one of our partner schools that we're collaborating with. But I think that since we have like 2 minutes left, it might be best to just go to the last slide and then we can share the slides and let everyone look at kind of the district and school context. So if you could go to like the implication slide. Yeah, thank you. So this is just kind of where we're going next with our research. And we have some points on KHSA specifically, and then also the other schools we're working with, and then more broadly synthesizing the cases with the histories and kind of just implications of this project. So for working with the individual schools, we're really emphasizing that we're not telling the school what they're doing wrong, but rather we're working as co-conspirators to figure out what is possible, what they can achieve while working against racial capitalism. And then just recognizing that they don't need our recommendations or reforms. They need people to be working with them to struggle with and for them. And then that really ties into like the purpose of our research. And it's really important to us that we're not researching just for the sake of research or just to publish an article or whatever, but we really are working towards change and liberation in these schools and communities. And then also kind of showing the broader public like what can be done and what people are doing. And then in that way, as Edwin was talking about with our framework of looking at organized abandonment, but then also resistance and joy, looking at how schools can work against racial capitalism and neoliberal policies in joyful and healing ways. And then also our research providing an example of a way to conduct research that is desire-centered rather than damage-centered and focusing on the struggles, but looking at the way that these communities are finding joy every day.
Thanks, Eliza. I'll put in the link also just one final construct that we're working with, which is, or concept and politics and vision, which is this notion of sanctuary schools. So thinking about school and community partnerships and schools, like not just thinking about community schools, but thinking about community schools as sanctuary schools. And so an organization, Juntos, an immigrant rights organization here in Philadelphia, has developed and has been advocating for this kind of five-pronged piece around, five-component piece around sanctuary schools. And we don't have time to go into it now, but I'll put that link in the chat so that people can also check that out as well. All right, thank you, everyone.